It's good to be with you again. This will be one of the last times because I've got so much stuff accumulating, but I wanted to talk today about a construction from the Wari language, also known as Pacas Novos, in Brazil, on the border between Brazil and Bolivia. And I'll start off with a quote from David Hume. "There's nothing in a number of instances different from every single instance, which is supposed to be exactly similar, except only that after a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect its usual attendant and to believe that it will exist. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, this customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection." This was, as you will recall, this was Hume's explanation of why we think one event causes another. It's just a habit in the way we view the events. The concept of habit entered very deeply into the philosophy of Charles Sanders Peirce, and Hume, of course, is extremely important. In our semiotic approach to language, we are particularly concerned about habit and how different correlations between meaning and form are shaped by habit into what we call syntax and morphology or constructions. And in some of the work I'm doing recently, I want to argue that all of these approaches are misguided: construction grammar, formal grammar, because they're trying to introduce into language language-specific devices as opposed to simply general principles of inference. When we set the agenda for this course as searching for strange things, the purpose was to find phenomena of natural language that stretch our understandings. In reviewing these constructions of Wari, my purpose is to discuss constructions that do not fit neatly into any model of formal syntax. This link, which may not be useful to you, is a link to the grammar that I wrote of Wari with Barbara Kern on Lingbuzz. But if you just search Wari grammar Lingbuzz, you can find the entire grammar, which otherwise will cost you $320 for the hardback and I think $45 for the paperback. But I put the entire grammar up on the web for free. This is a book that Barbara and I wrote. We started writing it in 1986. We finally published it in 1997. It's been out for a while. Wari is one of the most interesting languages. It was, in fact, selected at the Max Planck Institute as the language with the most rarities in the world, the most rare things, from the phonetics all the way to the grammar. It's a fascinating language and in some ways far more interesting than some of the constructions of Piraha that have gotten so much press around the world. So what are liminal constructions? What do I mean by this? This paper proposes a new type of morphosyntactic entity. I wrote this paper some time ago, and I published parts of it in different places, the International Journal of American Linguistics, in a volume on role and reference grammar, but I've never really published it all together, although I sent you a paper with all of it together. What I'm going to do here is propose an analysis of three kinds of liminal constructions in the Amazonian language Wari: paraphrastic pronouns, complex kinship terms, and intentional state constructions. We may not be able to get through all of this, but you can see it in the paper. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. I propose an account of liminal constructions and role and reference grammar in this, and I conclude that liminal constructions are not abnormalities, but fundamental components of the syntax of human languages. So it's much broader than Wari, but Wari offers us an opportunity to see them very clearly. I argue that though some current theories can account for Wari complex kinship terms and paraphrastic pronouns, as far as I can tell, role and reference grammar is the only one really equipped to handle the predicates of intentional state constructions. It's part of its general account of liminal categories. In other words, what Roland reference grammar, as far as I can tell, is the only theory that both predicts these things as a possibility and predicts their rarity, why they'll be so rare. So first, I'm going to review some of the more salient recent work establishing the generality of liminal categories. And the next, I'm going to describe the relevant constructions in Wari. Following these descriptive sections, I offer a theoretical analysis of the Wari constructions with the theory of Roland reference grammar and argue that this analysis can be extended straightforwardly to other categories. I might not get to that section here. Wari is an interesting culture. There are about a little less than 2,000 people living on the Bolivia-Brazil border. Until 1962, which is a few years after contact with the outside world, they were still cannibals. They practiced endo and exo cannibalism. And if you want to read about this, there's a wonderful book, actually two really good books on Wari cannibalism. One in Portuguese, Comendo como a gente, and the other one is is called Consuming Grief. And so Beth Conklin wrote the latter, and Aparecida Vilaça, Brazilian anthropologist, wrote the former. Both excellent books. So liminal categories or complex predicates or mixed categories have been noticed for some time. I'll just go over a couple of proposals. Tara Mohanan argues that a complex predicate construction is one in which two semantically predicative elements jointly determine the structure of a single syntactic clause. So she argues that examples like two are complex predicates. So Ram helped Nina, you get the help and do combining together to form a single verb. Actually, this is a very common construction in the Amazon and many other parts of the world where you get some sort of a verb plus a helping verb to make a single verb. Another type of mixed category is found in the work of Adele Goldberg, and she claims that complex predicates display a mismatch of lexical and phrasal properties. They act in some ways as a single word, and in other ways more like one word. And that's very similar to what we're going to see today, although what we see today is even more radical. The cases Goldberg discusses from Persian are superficially, at least, very much like the Hindi complex predicates. Ali hit the man. Ali talked with Babak, so you get word plus hit. So you get hit as its basic meaning, and you can combine it with another called talk with Babak. Now, it's not just a compound verb like a rabbit shooting or something like that. It is more, incorporated verb or something like that. These are actually function at some point like two verbs and at other points like a single verb. Andrew Carney, from the perspective of minimalism, argues that X-bar theory is redundant in the best case and wrong in the worst. As he puts it, any given phrase marker may bear properties of both traditional phrases and heads. What limits the behavior of phrase markers are other properties. So he wants to claim that there simply is no status to distinguish at a primitive level X0 from X bar or XP in the theory, and he gives in the theory of minimalism, and he gives a series of examples here with it. Since it's formalism, he's trying to derive this syntactically, what is a pattern of habits in the language. And so he says, whether a P marker is a phrase or a word is externally determined by the other principles of the grammar, and it's not primitive. So that's a very interesting observation, and Carney's work is one of several that have talked about this ambiguous or liminal nature between phrases and words. From Peirce's perspective, phrases, like a sentence is a symbol and a word is a symbol, and they both have similar ingredients. And at one level, they're different, but at another level, there's no need to distinguish one type of symbol from another. And in fact, the whole hierarchy of morphemes, words, phrases, sentences, discourse can all be reinterpreted in terms of the phenomena that occur in certain conjunctions of syntactic properties. Another example of mixed categories comes from what is known as paraphrastic morphology, and we'll see some more of this. This comes from the work of Ackerman and Stump. So you get in Udmurt for the verb go, the affirmative form is simple, the negative form is paraphrastic, and so you can see how you get two words, but in fact they fill cells in a paradigm. So that's why this has come to be known as paraphrastic morphology that spans a wider degree of units than you might otherwise have expected. Their proposal is that a lexeme may be realized synthetically or paraphrastically. The content of information associated with a paraphrase is not determined by the content of information associated with its individual parts. So in other words, you get a Gestalt effect. You put two parts together, they form sort of a single unit, a single cell of a paradigm, and their meaning is not the same as it's not a composed meaning. Compositionality doesn't produce the meanings. So that's also a very interesting fact, right? We talked about compositionality. Now, the first case I want to talk about is Wari demonstrative pronouns. There are really no personal pronouns because there's no I, you, she, he, it, that sort of thing in Wari, but they do have some demonstratives that combine with proclitics to form what we have called in our grammar of Wari demonstrative pronouns. So these demonstratives, not the demonstrative pronouns, but simple demonstratives are seen in 11. Qua, ka, ma, quine, kine. This masculine, feminine, this neuter, that proximate here, that masculine, feminine, distal, that neuter, distal. Now, so you can see examples of this. This man, qua, tarama, tarama, qua. Shirin, ka, this house. Karawa, ma, that animal. Narima, quine, that woman. Pana, kain, that tree. Very interesting system of gender in Wari. And you can see this in the grammar that we wrote of Wari, if you're interested. Temporal demonstratives can also be seen, not just spatial demonstratives, this, that, and the temporal. So, Jatna Wari Pakat, somebody just shot. This would be said, for example, in the village, of a shot audible in the distance. Or that person who just left is shooting. It can mean either one of those things. It's a demonstrative of an immediately past time. And you can use it with other things. What is that recently absent man's name? What is the name of that man recently departed? I am remembering my long absent brother-in-law. Kara pane is long absent. Notice that kara pane can only modify name, sister's husband, because the verb is marked for an incompatible tense. So it's present tense, I am remembering, and yet pane, if taken alone, would be past tense, but combined with the demonstrative, it gets that long absent person. The demonstrative pronouns in Wari are all paraphrastic, so masculine singular, proximate to speaker is kokwa, masculine singular proximate to hearer is koma, koma, distal, masculine singular is kokwine, feminine singular is kamkwa, kamma for proximate to hearer, and distal kamkwine. So the ko doesn't vary, the kam doesn't vary, the neuter e doesn't vary, you get ikat, ima, ikain. And then you get plural, karamkwa, karamma, karamquine. So you lose the gender distinction in the plural. The temporal demonstrative pronouns in Wari are given in the paradigm here, table 3. Kopaka kopakaranet, kopakarapanet. So we have in here one cell that Barbara, my co-author of the grammar, who lived with the Wari for 50 years, she said she's never observed this form, I pakat or I kara, but she predicts that it should turn up somewhere. And so these are really interesting. And what is the evidence that these things together form a paraphrastic liminal category, which is, you know what, I didn't say what liminal is. I assume you all know what liminal is, but in anthropology, it's the passage from one phase of life to another. It's a transitional space, transitional time. Puberty rites are liminal rituals, rituals of liminality, going from childhood to adulthood. But when something's permanently liminal, it would be neither a child nor an adult. It would be like a teenager. So these are like teenager particles mixed. There are distributional restrictions on these demonstratives. So for example, the constructions in tables 2 and 3 do not co-occur with other nouns. So where are my clothes that were just here a minute ago? Karane means just here shortly, recently absent clothes. But you can't see, so they only occur with a very restricted set of items. They have a number of restrictions on them, and you see those restrictions spelled out in more detail in the paper. Demonstratives may only appear sentence finally unless they co-occur with a proclitic, as in tables 2 and 3. So, oh wait, here's, so if you have a normal demonstrative, not a demonstrative pronoun, it only can appear at the end of the sentence. But when that proclitic is attached, then it may occur elsewhere. This is shown in example 20 is no problem because qua is at the end of the sentence. In example 21, it's ungrammatical because qua is not at the end of the sentence, which is an interesting restriction on demonstratives. But once they're combined with the proclitics, they can appear any place a noun can appear because now they're pronouns of a very limited type. It is this man that I dislike. Qua, so it's a demonstrative at the end, but in 25, we find kamma, a demonstrative pronoun, and that is now at the place of, it's a feminine proximate here, so this means Shijam saw her. Shijam saw that feminine human thing. This set of contrasts shows that the addition of the clitic to the demonstrative produces an item with a distribution wider than that of the demonstrative alone. This supports the idea that these are different kinds of words, non-endocentric phrases. And there's so many different facts that arise in the description of these terms and in the understanding of these Wari paraphrastic constructions that we won't have time to go into all of them, but the grammar of the language goes into them all in much detail. I will skip this one. Now, here's an interesting thing. Normally, the demonstrative, not the demonstrative pronoun, the demonstrative particle can modify, any argument. But there is a constraint on the demonstrative pronoun that it can only replace a direct object or a subject. It cannot replace a recipient. So the man gave her a fish. That's ungrammatical because kamquat, which would be here functioning as her, is taking the place of a recipient, her. Therefore, it has to be a full noun, or woman or girl. You have to have a full noun there. I gave the fish to this man. It's fine if it's not a demonstrative pronoun. If it's just quat and there's no kamquat, which is the demonstrative pronoun, and quat is just a demonstrative, there's no problem there. Demonstrative can occur with can refer to recipients. modify recipients, but not personal pronouns. So from various other examples that we have seen, the ungrammatical examples cannot be attributed to verb agreement or semantic incompatibility. This is just a restriction, a stipulation on this particular pronoun. There are a lot of lexical innovations in these mixed forms, which is a good source of evidence that you're producing a new kind of word. So the innovation in meaning is easy to grasp if they are words. So if you take tarama karane, tarama karapane, tarama pakarane, so these all refer to a masculine person in the past or long ago, either long ago or recent past, and you see the different particles that can combine. But in the paradigms, they don't indicate this pakara doesn't indicate anything about past, but it indicates gender. So it's the same form. Outside of the paradigm, it indicates a type of tense, but inside the paradigm, it indicates gender. Another interesting thing comes from the phonology, an argument that these are, so there's arguments that they're separate items, but also arguments that they're stressed like one. So the stress pattern of Wari is quite similar to French. You basically stress the last syllable of the word. Karampaka, karampakarapane. So if these are three words, you would expect the stress pattern to be karampakarapane. But since they're used as one word, it's karampakarapane. Pane is never stressable, so it doesn't get, it's not karampakarapane, it's karampakarapane. So these stress patterns are like words, even though these are complex paraphrastic elements. Now, kinship terms are discussed in detail in Everett and Kern. There are two formation classes of kinship terms, and there's inalienable and alienable possession suffixes used in the kinship terms. The first person singular inflection of 6 of the terms is suppletive, otherwise they all inflect for possession, like common sheet nouns. So the simple kinship terms are kamashit, kawanishit, humajishit. So you get these different uses. But the structure of these elements is historically like relative clauses, and yet they're used as special citation kinship forms. When you want to state in isolation a kinship form, you use one of these. And so these take on a special function, and they seem to be relative clauses, but they are stressed and behave as single words. Co-kinship terms are diachronically structured in the following word. The inflectional, sentence level inflectional morpheme of what was the relative clause precedes the first person singular form of the kinship term, and a tenseless active verbal inflectional clitic follows it. So you get kowere, our older sister. That is derived from koweiri. Koshari, our inclusive younger sister, koshairi. So these have all the properties of single words in the language, these kinship terms, but they can be analyzed into perfectly coherent relative clauses, although they're not stressed like relative clauses, and the vowel harmony within them is quite different. Consider again the fact that these kinship terms form a tighter phonological unit than other nouns derived from ko. This can be seen in certain phonological changes, which take place in the derived form in particular, asyllabification and glottal deletion, neither of which are otherwise found across word boundaries. For example, when ko precedes glottal agi, glottal, my older brother, as in 69, the word initial glottal plosive is dropped and ko becomes a labialized dorsal velar plosive. Crucial for this account of personal pronouns, this phonological change does not occur anywhere else when ko precedes a word, beginning with the glottal vowel sequence. So ma ko aka na, who is crying? Ma, kwa, ka, na, that's not allowed. See, here we've deleted the glottal before aka, and we've labialized the ka sound, and that's ungrammatical. But that's how you have to pronounce it when it's used as a kinship term. So you put the same words in sequence. If it's being used as a single word, you get phonological processes that are simply not allowed across word boundaries, and those include vowel harmony. So you get what would normally be a phrase, kote iri, but is now used as a single word in the language, kotere, and it's pronounced quite differently than it would be if those same sequences were found in a sentence. As they're pronounced as a word, you get vowel harmony. And koturut, kote urut, koturut, kote hue, you get kote hue. So example 72 shows that a non-first person clitic is not analyzed as part of the word, since the special citation and form includes optionally first person plural marking, but no other. So there are a lot of properties that show that these originate as separate terms, as relative clauses, but that they're now used as single words. Now, this could be a historical diachronic process. So the demonstrative pronouns are mixed categories. They have properties of words and phrases. The kinship terms have an etymology that begins, they're all sentences, but they're treated in the grammar synchronically as though they were single words. So there's a difference there between something that's mixed in its synchronic behavior versus something that's mixed in its derivation and ending point. But the most interesting set of constructions in Wari comes from what I call intentional state constructions. And these really raise interesting issues for the theory of syntax, phrase structure, and morphology. So we get these intentional state construction predicates have verb-like features, and they have several verb-like features. They look like sentences, but they have these several features of verbs. The embedded sentence occurs in the verb position of the matrix clause. The embedded sentence may undergo predicational modification, cliticization, and compounding, just like any other verb. Only the last syllable of the embedded sentence carries primary stress, just as the last syllable of a verb or verb compound carries primary stress. This would otherwise violate the normal stress rule that places primary stress on the final syllable of each word in a sentence, but these sentences are now stressed like words. There's no other potential predicate verb in the matrix clause. The inflectional clitics must follow the embedded sentence, just as they must follow the verb. Intentional state construction predicates are the only examples in the language of multiple clausal embeddings. So the language has verb compounding. The language does not have multiple subordination of complement clauses. And yet you can do what looks like multiple subordination of complement clauses in the verb position of the language. And these features have phrase-like, these predicates have phrase-like features. They have the structure of fully productive clauses or sentences manifesting internal WH questions, focus structures, and tree structures typical of clauses and sentences. They are subject to constraints on reference relative to the main clause, which would otherwise violate the anaphoric island constraint of postal 1969. So to get started describing these, let's just take the basic syntax of Wari. Wari is a verb object subject language. The verb always precedes direct and indirect objects, which in turn precede the subject. However, there are two basic types of non-embedded root sentences which manifest the VOS order somewhat differently. These are simple V initial sentences and sentences which begin with a word indicating the mode or illocutionary force, what Everett and Kern label complementizer sentences, a label that I no longer adhere to. Examples 75 to 77 show verb initial sentences, while 77 through 80 illustrate sentences with one of the small set of preverbal markers. In both types of sentence, tense must occur in the second position of the sentence. So you can put in the first position of the sentence an illocutionary mood marker, and then the second position is not the verb, but it is the inflectional clitic. inflection is always second in the sentence. If the verb is first, the inflection follows the verb. If the modal particle is first, the inflection precedes the verb. This is not uncommon. Cross-linguistically, that second position reserved for inflection in clitics is often referred to as Wackernagel's position, after the German linguist who first observed this phenomenon. So my father made a house long ago, so verb do, and then inflection, and then house, my father, and long ago. So verb, object, subject, long ago. Baskets are woven, weave, inflection, type of basket. So baskets are woven. Sentences with pre-verbal modal markers of the type of who is speaking. Ma koto mina. So in this one, we see that ma, which is not the verb, but the who, is first. So that means the inflectional particle has to be second, followed by the verb, followed by now, not the verbal inflectional clitic. So there always has to be a verbal inflectional clitic. And when there's nothing ahead of the verb in the sentence, nothing to the left of the verb, the verbal inflectional clitic is all that's needed. But when something precedes the verb, then the inflectional clitic has to appear between the two. And they come from different paradigms. Of whom is he speaking? You get the ko and the ka. Why is that child crying? Why? Then you get inful, then you get why, then cry, then third masculine. So you get very interesting constructions here with the constraint that the inflectional clitic be in second position. The verbal inflectional clitics carry tense, person, number, and gender, and they're all obligatory in Wari clauses and are manifested in two distinct clausal positions. In verb initial sentences, all four of these categories appear on a clitic immediately following the verb. We call these clitics verbal inflectional clitics. This is illustrated in 82 and 83. Oruwa went, so go is the first, and that's followed by na, the verbal inflectional clitic, followed by the subject. Hit is the verb, followed by the verbal inflectional clitic, followed by the pronoun for direct object, for subject, followed by the pronoun, the full name of the object. So as 83 shows, the verbal inflectional clitic agrees with both the subject and the object. Example 84 illustrates that the verbal inflectional clitic agrees with embedded sentences as well when these are verbal arguments. They're very interesting, but they also turn out to be quite interesting for our argument of these mixed category predicates. So sententional inflectional clitics versus the verbal. When modal material precedes the verb, as we've said, you get the inflectional clitic. When it doesn't, you get only the verbal inflectional clitic. But the verbal inflectional clitic is always found. So like in a negative clause in 86, is not, and then inflectional clitic, and then go. So the negation is separate from the verb, and then you get the inflectional clitic, and then you get the verbal inflectional clitic. So although tense is restricted to second position of the clause, regardless of which constituent appears in first position, the verbal inflectional clitics themselves are obligatory and can only attach to the verb or the predicate. So here's some intentional state constructions. There's a wide range of them in Wari, and they are really fascinating. So to get a quotative, to say the sentence, who went to Guajará? Guajará is a Brazilian town close to the, one of the closer towns to the Wari village. It's, I think, a couple of days by boat. Mako mau nain Guajará nam nanam oronari mataramashikon. Who went to Guajará, said the chief to the women. So where is so you start off with who go, and realis past present, so we know that it could be who's going or who went. Then we get the inflectional clitic. Now normally this has to follow the verb, so you could think this is just a normal clause, right? Because you've got the inflectional, then you've got the verb, then you've got the VIC, just like you would expect. But then you've got Guajará, and you've got these other inflectional clitics. So what are these? This is a verbal inflectional clitic, but there's no verb in front of it. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that, actually I should have more brackets here. This entire first line is the verb. It's stressed like a single word, the whole bunch of stuff here. And so the end of the embedded sentence, which is functioning not as the predicate per se, but as the verb, we'll see later that it's actually functioning as the nucleus, is Guajara. So this inflectional clitic is embedded, but this inflectional clitic, verbal inflectional clitic, is in the matrix clause, except that there's no verb before it. In fact, there's no verb except the embedded verb in the whole clause. So it is the predicate is who went to Guajara. That is the verb of the sentence. That's how you quote someone, is you make their words an actual predicate or a verb. Very different type of quotative construction. And then you get the children will eat food, we will eat food, the children say, the same type of construction. So in a quotative, you take the quotation, what somebody said, like a direct quote, and you put it in the verb position. And then it's inflected normally. But when you get to the end of that clause, since it is the verb, you get the stress, and then you get a verbal inflectional clitic, and this not nam would make no sense whatsoever unless what preceded it were the verb. And so our analysis uses that as one of many pieces of information, all the ones I gave up above, to say that this is actually the verb, not merely a verb phrase, but actually in a formal linguistic account, the only place to put this is as a verb. In Carney's account, that actually wouldn't be a problem, because he said that you determine whether something is X0 or XP based on where you find it. So here we find what normally would be an XP, but it's now in an X0 position, so treat it as an X0. But he can't get some of the other facts that we're going to see. There's no verb to say in these sentences. It is implied from the structure. So it's like saying, the chief to the women who went to Guajara. There's no verb say. The content of this implied verb appears in the verb position in this special liminal use of embedded sentence that is used by the speakers to recover the meaning. We use these for supposition and purpose too. Do you think my son is strong? Literally, do you think of, there's no verb to think. Do you of my son? He is probably strong. Here's one I like. The women shucked corn so that we say, we will make cornbread. They said more freely, the woman shucked corn in order to make cornbread. So you get a bunch of embeddings here. You get 3 embedded clauses to get purpose. And I'll show you some structures for these clauses later. You get the same for conditionals, for refusals, for emphasis. There's a wide range of these intentional state construction, including sequentiality and comparison. It seems like Mon drank cornbread. Like drink, corn drink, ma, not mon ma. It seems that mon drop. All of these intentional state construction embedded clauses can be combined, as the following examples show. This is highly relevant to the present discussion because multiple embeddings are not otherwise allowed. So if you look at this example, direct speech and sequential sentence as a single intentional state construction predicate. So direct speech, we will sleep here, pi am to shin, and then you get the inflectional element, and then ka ek a kakama, you get another sentence. So here you've got 2 sentences and followed by verbal inflectional clitics, which means that everything that precedes this na is in the verb position. Normally, you don't get in multiple embeddings. You wouldn't get 2 clauses together like this in complement position. You can only get them in the verb position. And the reason for that is because they're now being treated like verbs, and this is a verb compound. So you do get compounds. You don't get multiply embedded complement clauses. So when they're found in the verb position, they're not clauses. They're treated as verbs, except that it's not quite that simple. You get many other examples of that. Desiderative derived predicate and sequential sequence, future tense derived predicate and supposition, comparative derived predicate and sequential, imperative sentence and sequential sentence. So you get all of these different combinations and in the verb position. This is a severe challenge for some theories. I have, in when I used to teach a course in minimalism, back when I was at the University of Pittsburgh, I love bringing out these structures and offering people extra credit if they could come up with an analysis for these that fit merge. I haven't argued at significant length about this anywhere, but I don't think these fall under a simple merge analysis because of the properties that are associated with them. They would fall under a constructional analysis or a construction grammar analysis or a role and reference grammar analysis fairly easily. So let's just go a little bit into the structure of role and reference grammar. So role and reference grammar has what's called the layered structure of the clause. Notice that there's ternary branching, there's exocentrism. The phrase doesn't have to be headed by something of the same type. So in a sentence, you first get the possibility of a left dislocated position, which is filled by an adverb, yesterday. Then you can get the pre-core slot, which is a noun phrase, what. Then you can get, so the sentence dominates a clause, which dominates a core, and the core is the argument, nucleus, and argument. Robin show to Pat, and then you get a right periphery in the library. Yesterday, what did Robin show to Pat in the library? And then you get these things that follow under the verb. So the verb is a nucleus of the core, and the tense marks the clause, and the illocutionary force marks the clause. So what's below the lines is actually linking to semantics, and what's above is the syntax in role and reference grammar. And you can get syntactic templates combining. Role and reference grammar says that sentences are formed from a set of templates. So it's not complete creativity as people would have us believe, but rather than generate these from rewrite rules, like construction grammar, role and reference grammar allows for a set of templates and can form clauses from templates. I won't go into that because that's going to be less essential for us. But take a sentence like Dan is belligerent. That is a sentence dominating a clause, dominating a core, and the argument of that sentence, that core, that clause, that sentence is Dan, and then the auxiliary is, and then the predicate is belligerent. Notice that the adjective can function as a predicate. It doesn't have to be a verb, it can be an adjective. So Dan is belligerent, that's the structure for that. In general, terminal functions in role and reference grammar, such as argument and nucleus, will be dominated or linked to a word. This is the default case and is symmetrical linking. Relatively rarer, however, a terminal functional node is asymmetrically linked to a phrase. And this is illustrated in 103 and 104. So you get something like, normally you would expect a word here under the argument position in role and reference grammar, but they allow a clause. That Fred won the race, surprise Mary. So the structure of that sentence in role and reference grammar is to simply put that Fred won the race in the initial argument position. Notice you don't see subjects and objects in here. Role and reference grammar has a different pragmatic interface with the information structure and uses pivots and semantic macro roles and a series of other things which we're ignoring here. Fred's winning the race, surprise Mary. Here's another example. This is called asymmetrical linking. It's asymmetrical because you've got two words, but they're linked in as equals to a sentence. So the sentence is not of the same type. These are asymmetrical. They're rare, but according to role and reference grammar, but they can be generated. So in Wari, the principal component of an RG analysis is that the Wari nucleus may dominate a clause. That is, it allows asymmetrical juncture, just as the core argument and English examples above. So consider the representation of the Wari sentence, who went to Guajara, said the chief to the women, which we've seen. So that's fairly complex. You've got a sentence dominating a clause, dominating a core, the nucleus of the core, and the nucleus is in the beginning position, right? Because this is a VOS language. So you get the nucleus, the predicate. The predicate dominates a clause with the pre-core ma, and then it's got, as its predicate, it's got ko mau in. So it's got ko as the predicate, but we link this up in the semantic representation, mau na'in, mau nine, to modify the core because it's tense, and then guajara. So The arguments, oronarima and taramashikon, are out here. There's no verb say, but there is a nucleus. So in that sense, this is just a typical Wari structure nucleus. What's atypical is the asymmetrical linking that allows a clause to be dominated by the predicate, be dominated by the nucleus clause. So my analysis implies that Wari is not, properly speaking, a verb-object-subject language, but it's rather a nuclear undergoer actor language, NUA language. This proposal, in fact, takes us some way towards an account of the Wari facts. Let's just consider a few. We're running out of time. Wari inflectional clitic placement. Wari inflectional clitics follow the nucleus. If I say that, all the facts we noticed up above make sense. Whatever the nucleus of the phrase is, it can be a sentence, it can be a verb, it can be a particle. If it's the first position in the sentence, it's the nucleus, and that means that the inflectional clitics have to follow it immediately. A liminal category is of a language L shares otherwise mutually exclusive formal and functional properties in common with words and phrases simultaneously. That would be one type of liminal category. One can imagine others. So let's think about primary stress placement in Wari, because this also supports these. So we've seen several properties of these nuclear elements in Wari, these intentional state constructions that seem like sentences, but the stress placement is treats them like a word. So we can generate this fact in a sort of optimality theoretic way. Constraint 1, only one stress per nucleus. Constraint 2, stress the last syllable of the word. Ranking, only one stress per nucleus outranks stress the last syllable of the word. This means that in kaushi karawa, instead of stressing every word, which is constraint 1, constraint 2, stress the last syllable of every word. Constraint 1 is more important, and constraint 1 says stress only once, there's only one stress per nucleus. So it will be the last one. So if we run through the derivation, we get kaushi karawa, which is the optimal form. It produces the least violations of the stress placement principles. So in English, you get these multiple complement embeddings. They're unnatural, but you can still say them. John believes that Bill thinks that John thinks that someone else likes it. Why doesn't Wari allow these multiple embeddings? The role and reference grammar analysis is able to explain this restriction straightforwardly. And basically, we can simply say that Wari allows one level of embedding, one complement clause, and no more. But it allows multiple embeddings in the nuclear position, because that's a different position. It's not compounding of the complement. That's not embedding of the complement, that's compounding of the verb. So this is an interesting fact. You don't get syntactic embedding, multiple syntactic embeddings in Wari at one level, but you do get multiple embeddings if you're talking about verb compounding. So you can't simply say that Wari allows recursion freely. It puts limits on recursion. Multiple complement embedding being prohibited is a limitation on recursion. Embedding itself is not recursion. Multiple embeddings without restriction, the reason that 110 illustrates recursion, well, it actually doesn't illustrate recursion, but the reason that it could illustrate recursion is because this can keep going on. So as long as there's no upper limit, and I can keep going on with 110, that's produced by recursion. Otherwise, it's embedding, which is, if you have recursion, you likely have embedding, but the fact that you have embedding does not mean that you have recursion. But you do get recursion at the level of the verb or the nucleus in Wari. You don't get it at the level of the sentence as a whole, but you get it at the level under the nucleus. So if we were to go back to this right here, Wari allows recursion, multiple recursion here, as far as I know, without a limit right here, but it doesn't allow it on this side, okay? So that's where this is an interesting constraint. Above the nucleus, Wari doesn't allow recursive structures. Below the nucleus, it does allow recursive structures. That's not a problem for anybody's theory, so far as I know, so I don't mention it that way. It's just an extremely interesting fact that illuminates our concept of recursion. So now there is, I'll skip that. There's more. Let's see, do I want to skip that? Yeah. This is how the multiple embeddings handled at the level of the nucleus. So under the nucleus in Wari, you get compounded nuclei, nucleus dominated by nucleus. But you can't do this above the nucleus because it's a process that only happens to the nucleus. And more complexity. They all fell into the water. Pon, fall, enter, go, completely, third plural. They all fall into the water. So then you get all these nuclei. This is really cool. Pan, korom, mama, pin. And then this one dominates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you get these other markers. I'm not sure that this one's doing any work here. Sorry about that. So you get at least 4 levels of nuclei under a single nucleus, but no embedding outside of that. So this really does show recursion, but at a level we might not have otherwise expected it in Wari. That's another thing that makes Wari so fascinating. So what are some of the theoretical consequences of this? Inbound anaphoric islands. Not everybody believes in anaphoric islands, but Postal argued strongly for those. So any Reagan, any Trump fan likes him. Well, according to some analyses, that's an ungrammatical sentence because Trump is, any Trump lover likes him. Trump is is made into a word, and therefore it can't refer out the Trump lover. Any Trump lover likes him. Him can't refer to Trump. Some people do allow him to refer to Trump, though, and in for those dialects, anaphoric islands don't seem to be a big problem. But they have inbound versus outbound constraints in Wari. So the inbound anaphoric island is while phrases can contain anaphoric and deictic uses of syntactically independent pronouns, derived words and compounds cannot. So a noun phrase in the intentional state construct, and that is the embedded predicate, cannot be referenced on the matrix verb, inflectional clitic, or any way in the matrix clause. So you can, but the matrix NP can be referenced on the embedded verbal inflectional clitic. So if I say saw John Bill, VOS, Bill saw John, nothing in that's above saw can refer to something inside of saw, but there could be a marker on saw that refers to something outside that. And there are plenty of examples. So are you going to weave a mat? Tinta wima. Weave, one singular realis, future, mat. So I will weave a mat, you say. But the next one is ungrammatical because this in refers into its neuter and it refers to mat. It can't do that. There can't be something out here that refers to something inside the embedded predicate. Same thing, kaushi karawa nana huijima, the children will eat the food, but I can't have this in, which refers to animal, because that violates the inward anaphoric island. But there is an obligatory clitic agreement constraint, which says that if a third person object is referenced on the matrix verbal inflectional clitic, then it is also referenced on the embedded verbal inflectional clitic. So to taun, maun, wom. So this is masculine and this is masculine. It has to be here. If a third person object is referenced on the matrix verb, so here's the third person object, then it has to be found here. So that's fine. But if you leave the on off, then the sentence is ungrammatical. So there has to be an asymmetrical agreement. If a particular marker is used here, it must also be used here. And we've gone over the stress facts already, and some of the historical facts. I'll skip the linking rules. So, as in so many areas of thought about relations in the world, Hume seems to have anticipated this discussion by developing the still relevant notion of how people come to impute oneness and causation to different pairings. Meaning comes in where none was before, based on reanalysis of the world around us. In that sense, construction-based approaches to grammatical analysis are a footnote to Hume. In fact, all grammar is. Another important lesson of this paper is that if Roland reference grammar is right in any event, things that seem to be morphology may not be. This does not follow from X-bar theoretical approaches to syntax and morphology or distributed morphology, but it does follow from Roland reference grammar's proposal that certain phrasal categories are headed by a nuke node. It's that nuke node that's crucial. And to summarize some additional, and in the paper I discussed this more, so in English we have this problematic construction that, for many years formal theories offered no solution to. So like I know the right answer, Grandpa wink. So my grandson, is, I'm trying to tell him that that's not the right answer, and he gives me a little wink that is, I describe as, I do have the right answer, Grandpa wink, that kind of wink. So like German and English, which used to be German, you can expand the number of adjectives out. And one way that that's been handled by formal grammars is to say that these are frozen expressions that are treated like words, but it's fully productive. And Roland reference grammar predicts this very easily. These adjectives fall under the nucleus of the adjectival position. And the nucleus can allow multiple embeddings. Whereas to have productive word compounding like that actually forms an adjectival phrase is very difficult for formal theories. And I discussed this to some degree in the paper. Some other points of theoretical interest is that we can, Wari intentional state constructions illustrate an entire paradigm of paraphrastic morphology, offering strong support for the proposals of others who've worked on paraphrastic morphology. Two, they show that paradigms may apparently be created to satisfy communicative needs, so long as they can be filled by liminal categories, and concomitantly, not all examples of paraphrastic morphology can be related to the special morphological notion of blocking. You don't need to worry about that. But we see these paradigms that seem to be popping into being synchronically, the diachrony live, and these liminal categories allow us to do this. In a Peircean perspective, liminal categories are just another symbol. We're symbols, and symbols. How do we get symbols? I've argued at length that symbols are formed largely by habits and cultures. And these that fits independently what Hume said. And Peirce would agree with that. And so as we see things together and we start to see correlations between form and meanings, we form symbols. And sometimes those symbols fit what other theories might put as a word or a morpheme or a sentence. But really what this shows us is that those types of divisions in grammar, morpheme, word, phrase, sentence, are not always operative, not always helpful distinctions, and we need to have a wider perspective. And so I argue here that nucleus gives us that kind of symbolic variation. The Roland reference grammar concept of nucleus allows us to express these things that happen in Wari fairly straightforwardly, and they work for many other languages as well. So in searching for strange categories and lessons to learn from them, the Wari grammar produces some of the greatest examples I'm aware of in the linguistic world, and all the nearly 8,000 languages spoken in the world today. So Thanks very much. If you have questions as you look at the paper, please do send me comments, and I will, or questions, and I'll try my best to answer them. I will say that given the number of other commitments that I have coming soon, I'm not going to be able to offer many more of these classes. If I am able to, I will announce it. But right now, these projects are pressing on me fairly in my commitments. So I'm going to have to cut back on that. But thank you. It's been a nice opportunity to talk about some of the ideas. I will be again developing all of these ideas further in the book that I'm currently working on Persian linguistics, chapter in the history of pragmatist thought. Thank you.